Here's a question nobody ever really asks out loud. What did people actually do before pads and tampons existed? Because periods aren't new. They've been happening every single month to roughly half of humanity for the entire span of human history. So what did people actually use? Let's talk about it. Start in ancient Egypt, because the evidence is genuinely older than you'd expect. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text dating back to around 1550 BCE, describes rolled, softened papyrus used internally. Basically, a tampon made from a plant thousands of years before modern manufacturing existed. Ancient Greek medical writings, including texts in the Hippocratic tradition, describe lint wrapped around small pieces of wood, not glamorous, but functional, and clearly thought through. The Romans reportedly used wool, absorbent, reusable, and something most households already had lying around anyway. And across countless other cultures, the materials were basically whatever was locally available and worked. Moss in parts of Europe, soft bark fiber in some Aboriginal Australian communities, rabbit fur among some indigenous groups in North America. None of these cultures were talking to each other. They all landed on the same basic idea completely independently. Find something soft, find something absorbent, make it work. There's an even older, stranger thread to this story too. Some archaeologists, including researcher Alexander Marshack, have proposed that certain notched bone artifacts from the Paleolithic era, tens of thousands of years old, may represent early lunar or menstrual tracking systems. It's a genuinely debated theory, not universally accepted, but if true, it would mean humans were consciously tracking menstrual cycles long before agriculture, before writing, before almost anything we consider civilization. Even the theory itself being controversial says something. The idea that ancient humans might have paid close, careful attention to menstrual cycles apparently required convincing. Here's where it gets more complicated though. It wasn't just a materials problem, it was also a stigma problem. And that part of the story is honestly a lot messier. Across huge swaths of history, menstruation wasn't just inconvenient. It was treated as something dangerous, or unclean, or spiritually risky. Leviticus, in the Hebrew Bible, includes purity laws specifically addressing menstruation. Similar restrictions show up across many other religious and cultural traditions worldwide, often requiring separation from communal spaces during this time. In some regions, this took the form of menstrual huts, physical structures where women were required to stay apart from the rest of the household. In parts of Nepal, a practice called chhaupadi still exists today in some communities, despite being made illegal, and it has tragically led to real, documented deaths from exposure and unsafe conditions. So the story isn't only what did people use, it's also how much shame got layered on top of a completely normal biological process. Which brings us to the industrial era, where things get surprisingly strange. In 1888, Johnson & Johnson released one of the first mass-produced disposable pads called Lister's towels. It should have been revolutionary. It mostly wasn't, because stores were often too embarrassed to display it, and advertising the product openly was considered inappropriate for the time. A genuinely useful invention, quietly sabotaged by social discomfort. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected direction entirely: war. During World War I, nurses working with wounded soldiers noticed something. A material called cellulose, a highly absorbent wood pulp product originally developed for surgical bandages, worked remarkably well for menstrual use too. It absorbed roughly 5 times better than cotton, and it was significantly cheaper to produce at scale, which mattered enormously during a war that consumed bandages faster than anyone could have anticipated. After the war ended, that same manufacturing knowledge got repurposed, and Kotex launched in the early 1920s using that exact wartime material. So one of the most widely used feminine hygiene products in history has roots in battlefield medical supplies. Nobody puts that on the box. Then, in 1929, an American physician named Earle Haas patented a design that looked a lot like the modern tampon, complete with a cardboard applicator, and licensed it to a small company that would eventually become Tampax. Haas reportedly developed the design after a friend mentioned using a sponge internally out west, a solution she found more practical than the bulky pads available at the time. He refined it, patented it, and struggled for years to find anyone willing to fund it, precisely because investors were nervous about backing a product nobody wanted to publicly discuss. Menstrual cups actually go back further than most people assume too. Inventor Leona Chalmers patented a reusable rubber design in the early 1930s. It was genuinely ahead of its time. It also mostly flopped, partly due to design limitations and largely because talking openly about menstrual products was still considered deeply taboo, even in advertising meant to sell them. Historian Sharra Vostral, who has extensively researched the history of menstrual technology, argues that many of these products succeeded or failed based less on how well they worked and more on how comfortable society was even acknowledging periods existed at all. Which honestly explains a lot about why some genuinely good inventions took decades longer to catch on than they should have. So here's the actual through line. For thousands of years, humans consistently solved the practical half of this problem: papyrus, wool, moss, cotton. The materials kept improving. But the harder problem, the shame wrapped around the entire topic, took far longer to even start unraveling. And honestly, it still hasn't fully gone away. If you've ever whispered the word tampon in a public bathroom like you were trading state secrets, congratulations, you're carrying forward a stigma with a genuinely ancient paper trail. Subscribe, because apparently that paper trail goes back further than papyrus itself. So the next time you grab a product off a shelf without a second thought, remember it took thousands of years of quiet innovation, wartime bandages, and one very stubborn societal hang-up to get here. The materials were never really the hard part, the silence was.